A single mother arrives late for work and is fired in front of everyone, until a millionaire steps in and offers her a much better position. The clock read 8:15 a.m. when the heavy coffee shop door opened, and Sarah, her uniform wrinkled and her face still wet with tears, hurried in. The place was crowded. Executives in ties chatted loudly, students tapped away on their laptops, and every glance seemed to fall on her like sharp blades. The impatient manager crossed his arms in front of the counter and loudly for all to hear snapped, "You think this place is a joke? Being late again, you're fired." The piercing silence was followed by muffled laughter and looks of contempt. Sarah tried to explain, her voice trembling. "My son got sick. I had to take him to the doctor." But no one would listen. The manager raised his voice even higher, ensuring every customer witnessed the scene. "Excuses don't fill the cash register. Get your things and get out of here." In the middle of the room, Sarah held back tears, crushed by the weight of public shame, never imagining that that moment of humiliation would change her life forever. As Sarah gathered up her apron and attempted to leave with dignity, a firm voice broke the tension. A tall man in an impeccable suit and an icy gaze rose from one of the nearby tables. Everyone recognized him immediately. Ethan Caldwell, a discreet millionaire and heir to one of the largest corporations in the country. He walked to the counter, his footsteps sounding like a verdict, and faced the manager. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said calmly. The manager swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, but the laughter died down and the room froze. Ethan turned to Sarah and, in front of everyone, declared, "I need someone like you in my office. You're hired." Shock rippled through every corner of the coffee shop. Sarah, still confused, barely managed to react. The audience, which had previously laughed at her, now watched in silence, unable to process the turn of events. What had seemed like a definitive defeat had become an unexpected turn, fraught with mystery and a fate no one dared predict. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. In the heart of New York, where the streets never seem to sleep and every corner carries stories of haste and survival, the Morning Brew coffee shop was a meeting place of contrasts. Businessmen in impeccable suits shared the space with ordinary workers, all seeking the same thing, a coffee to sustain their long days. There the hustle and bustle never stopped. The strong aroma of roasted beans mingled with the constant sound of hurried orders, scraping chairs, and conversations that crossed paths without ever meeting. It was a perfect stage for scenes of power and contempt, an environment where the strong dictated the pace and the weak had to swallow silent humiliations. Among trays and hot cups, Sarah occupied the most invisible position, server. Her hair, always tied in an improvised bun, betrayed the lack of time her life afforded her. Her eyes, marked by sleepless nights, revealed the weight of responsibilities few in that room could imagine. Though she was just an employee, she carried within her a whole world of struggles, scars, and fragile hopes. In that space lit by large windows, where the morning light reflected off the metal tables and highlighted the shine of the customers' expensive clothes, Sarah was just another disposable cog in the machine. The manager, a man with a strident voice and a perpetually suspicious look, kept the employees under constant pressure. For him, every minute was worth more than the dignity of those under his command. One slip-up, one delay, was enough for the shame to be exposed before everyone. And it was in this climate of constant tension that Sarah, on that particular morning, arrived late, her hurried footsteps echoing on the polished floor, unaware that all eyes would soon turn to her. There was something cruel about fate. While executives laughed between sips of coffee and students typed non-stop, Sarah carried on her shoulders the weight of having left her sick son at home, supported only by the neighbor who volunteered to help. But no one there knew that. To those watching, she was simply the employee who hadn't fulfilled her obligation. The manager waited impatiently behind the counter, his hard gaze fixed on her, ready for the public spectacle that was about to begin. The already tense atmosphere transformed into a silent courtroom where Sarah would be judged defenseless, where her private life would be crushed by the weight of collective indifference. Little did she know that, among the morning's customers, someone was watching with eyes that not only saw but judged, with a power far greater than any manager could imagine. And that someone was about to change the course of that story forever. Sarah never knew life as an open field of choices. From childhood, doors seemed to close before she even reached them. She grew up in a forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of Detroit, where houses creaked with abandon and streetlights barely illuminated the cracked sidewalks. Her father disappeared when she was 5, leaving only the echo of broken promises and an overworked mother who struggled to support her family by cleaning the homes of the wealthy. Sarah learned early on the cruel difference between those who had too much and those who settled for scraps. While other children dreamed of dolls and bicycles, she dreamed of seeing a full refrigerator. By 10, she was already helping her mother, carrying buckets and scrubbing floors in houses that seemed like palaces compared to her reality. She observed those luxurious spaces as if peering into another planet, a planet she would never belong to. But there was something burning inside her, a silent force that made her resist. Adolescence brought new pains. Her mother fell ill, consumed by years of effort and exhaustion, and ended up leaving before Sarah turned 18. It was that same year that she met her son's father, a young man who seemed to hold the promise of a better future, but who disappeared as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only the child in her arms and unpayable debts. Sarah, still too young, saw motherhood as both a burden and a miracle. Between cheap diapers and sleepless nights, she found her son the only reason to carry on. But the world would not forgive. Her condition. With temporary jobs and salaries that barely covered rent, Sarah experienced the bitter taste of rejection. She often heard cutting phrases, "You're not suited for this position," or "We can't hire someone who's absent because of a child." With each closed door, each dismissive look, she accumulated invisible scars. And yet, she kept going. The image of her walking through the snow, pushing a stroller with her gloved, freezing hands, perfectly captures her story. A woman in constant struggle against an indifferent world. Time passed, but the wound of abandonment never healed. Sarah carried with her the memory of always being last in line, the first to be discarded. She carried the weight of poverty on her shoulders, but also a gaze hardened by pain. And yet there was something in her that not even life could tear away, a silent dignity that endured even when all seemed lost. This dignity, hidden beneath cheap uniforms and hurried steps, was the same dignity that would one day be noticed by eyes that would judge her not for her lateness, but for her courage to exist. That morning, as the clock ticked mercilessly, the manager had already planned how he would expose Sarah. He needed more than just efficiency. He needed a spectacle to reaffirm his authority in front of the other employees, and even the customers watching as an unwitting audience. Her lateness became the perfect excuse. But what Sarah didn't know was that, minutes before her arrival, a conversation at the counter had made her life a target. 2 young executives, regulars at the coffee shop, were laughing among themselves, betting that the manager would lose his temper if she showed up late again. The manager, hearing the provocation, puffed out his chest and, overcome with vanity, promised, "If she sets foot in here after 8, I'll fire her in front of everyone. I want to see if she learns." The words spread through the room like wildfire, permeating whispers and knowing glances. Some customers even leaned forward expectantly, waiting for the moment when the promise would be fulfilled. When Sarah entered, breathless and tired-eyed, the tension was already mounting. It was as if she'd walked into an invisible trap. The manager, instead of calling her aside, raised his voice to the entire room, relishing the chance to be the center of attention. "I told you this wouldn't be cheap," he shouted, pointing to the clock on the wall, turning every second into a public accusation. The executives chuckled quietly, certain they were witnessing the execution of their bet. To Sarah, none of this made sense. She only felt the wave of shame rising over her head, unable to comprehend that, at that moment, she was merely a pawn in a game of egos. The room, previously charged with everyday conversation, now seemed to vibrate with an anxious silence, the kind of silence that precedes a fall. And it was on this stage of humiliation, built by the cruelty of others, that fate decided to plant the seed of a turnaround no one expected. The moment Ethan Caldwell rose from his corner table in the cafe, shattered the scene like a bolt of lightning from the sky. Until then, Sarah had only known this man from afar, through magazines and the hushed conversations that sometimes echoed among the wealthier patrons. He was the kind of inaccessible figure, a millionaire shrouded in mystery, someone whose presence seemed out of place in such a mundane space. But that morning, the impossible approached her with firm steps, each tap of his shoe echoing on the polished floor like a drum of judgment. Sarah, still clutching the apron, raised her confused eyes and met his. Ethan's gaze held neither contempt nor pity, but a kind of calculated coldness, as if analyzing something only he could see. The customers, previously absorbed in their routine, now held their breath, transformed into witnesses to an unexpected spectacle. The surprised manager tried to maintain his composure, but his nervousness escaped through his trembling hands and the sweat forming on his forehead. Ethan approached the counter, his voice low but firm enough to cut through the quiet room. "What exactly is the problem here?" he asked, his expression unchanged. The manager swallowed hard but replied arrogantly, "Irresponsible employee, always making excuses. This place has no place for people like that." The answer seemed rehearsed, part of his promise to humiliate Sarah. Still stunned, she opened her mouth to try to defend herself, but Ethan held up a hand, signaling silence. "Interesting," he murmured, looking at her again, as if reading beyond what anyone else could see. Time seemed to stretch. Sarah felt her heart race, not just from fear of exposure, but from the strange sensation of standing before someone who could change the course of her life with a single sentence. Their first contact wasn't marked by sweet words or gestures of comfort. It was hard, dry, almost cruel, in the way he observed her. But there was something there that no one noticed, a spark of silent recognition, as if this millionaire and this lonely young mother shared a secret that had not yet been revealed. The entire room awaited the verdict, unaware that the simple act of Ethan approaching had already changed Sarah's fate forever. The manager, inflamed by the invisible audience watching him, couldn't bear Ethan's intervention. He felt challenged, as if the millionaire had wrested control of the scene he had carefully engineered. He straightened his posture, lifted his chin, and in front of everyone, hurled his words like daggers. "Mr. Caldwell, with all due respect, this is none of your business. This woman is lazy, constantly making excuses for delays, and thinks she can carry the world on her shoulders just because she's a single mother. She's unprofessional, unreliable, and not even good enough to make a decent cup of coffee." The muffled laughter spread through the room again. Like embers being fanned, Sarah felt her legs tremble, her eyes sting, and even trying to maintain her dignity, she couldn't hold back the single tear that slid down her face. The contempt was collective. A well-dressed customer by the door muttered to her friend, "That's what happens when you hire people with no future." Another young man, chuckling softly, added, "A single mother always makes excuses, never delivers." Every word, every sidelong glance, hurt more than the dismissal itself. Sarah wasn't just losing her job, she was being judged as a person, crushed by stigmas that would forever haunt her. Ethan, impassive, let the manager finish his spectacle. With each sentence, the millionaire merely narrowed his eyes, as if the coldness were a mask for something boiling inside. When the manager finished, breathing with the false victory of someone who believes he's won, Ethan let out a short, disdainful laugh. "Interesting to hear all this from someone whose only skill is humiliating others to feel great," he said, his tone so low it sounded like a whisper, but it echoed like thunder in the room. Sarah, however, felt no immediate relief. The weight of humiliation had already settled too deeply. The silence after Ethan's laughter, seemed to scream inside her. Every face still watched her with the same judgmental edge, as if waiting for her to crumble. And in that moment, in the heart of New York, she realized that this episode wasn't just a fall, it was the beginning of a much larger game, where dignity, power, and destiny would intertwine in ways no one in that place could have predicted. Sarah clutched her apron tightly to her chest, her eyes still watering, but something inside her suddenly flared like a flame that refused to be extinguished. For a moment, she put aside the pain of humiliation and lifted her head. The voice that came from her mouth wasn't weak or trembling, it was firm, calm, and it pierced the heavy silence of the room like an arrow. "You think I don't know?" she said, looking the manager straight in the eye. The man blinked in confusion, and before he could respond, she continued. "The bet you made with those two guys at the counter, the laughter they shared when they saw I was late. I knew everything." The shock was immediate. The executives, taken aback, shifted in their seats, trying to hide their embarrassment. The manager, now pale, stammered, searching for an answer that wouldn't come. Sarah stepped forward. Her tears now transformed into something harder. Courage. "Do you think I'm blind? That I don't notice the looks, the whispers? That I don't feel the cruelty dripping from every gesture? I keep coming here day after day because I need to support my son. But don't mistake my need for ignorance. I see, I know." The entire room held its breath. For the first time, the weight of judgment fell not on her, but on those who ridiculed her. Sarah had turned the tables on them with a simple revelation, dismantling the arrogance built on her pain. Ethan, nearby, watched with an expression that mixed surprise and something deeper, perhaps respect. The customers who had previously laughed now looked away, ashamed to be part of this cruel spectacle. The manager, unmoored, tried to maintain his authority, but the truth had already torn through the room like a bolt of lightning through the night. Sarah didn't need to shout to be heard. Her strength lay in her silence, in the dignity she endured, even when crushed. By exposing that she had always known about the deception, she transformed the scene of humiliation into a reversed courtroom, where the accusers became defendants before everyone. And in that moment, the millionaire understood that this woman was not a passive victim, but someone who faced the world with a courage that not even he, with all his wealth, possessed. Ethan left the coffee shop that morning carrying more questions than answers. Sarah's steady gaze, her revelation about the bet, and the quiet courage with which she faced her shame echoed within him like an uncomfortable melody. He couldn't shake the feeling that he knew her from somewhere. And it was this uneasiness that led him, days later, to discreetly investigate her life. With his influence, it wasn't difficult to find records: her full name, a simple address in a forgotten neighborhood, a history of temporary jobs. But what really struck him was a discovery buried in old newspapers and electronic files, a story that connected his past to hers. Years ago, when he was still young and reckless, Ethan was studying at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. During a lavish party hosted by friends in his circle, a fire broke out in a wing of the campus. Chaos ensued, and while many fled, a cleaning lady risked her life to open exits and save dozens of students. Among them was Ethan himself, who never forgot the feeling of being pulled out of the smoke by firm, soot-covered hands. The woman who saved him was named Margaret, and her photo was printed in newspapers at the time. Looking at that old image, Ethan froze. Margaret was Sarah's mother, the same mother who died young, consumed by illnesses caused by years of overwork and systemic neglect. And there was the link, the daughter of that brave woman now publicly humiliated, supporting a young son alone and facing the world with her mother's same bravery. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Ethan's fortune, built on inheritances and business dealings, was worthless compared to the silent debt that now gripped him. He owed his life to her mother, and Sarah, unbeknownst to her, carried in her veins the same blood that had once given her the chance to exist. The millionaire's arrogance began to crumble in the face of this truth, and what had once seemed a simple gesture of curiosity now became an inevitable call of fate. Sarah disappeared like a shadow melting into the sunrise. After that unexpected confrontation at the coffee shop, She never returned to any of the temporary jobs Ethan's colleagues had seen her at before. Her small apartment in the forgotten neighborhood was empty, with a cluttered mailbox and neighbors who could only repeat, "She moved," didn't say where. The silence that had settled over her life echoed in Ethan's mind like an unbearable weight. Accustomed to controlling people, to deciding their fates with a single signature on million-dollar contracts, he found himself powerless in her absence. Every morning he passed the coffee shop, hoping to meet those steady eyes again. The empty chair reminded him that Sarah had slipped beyond his reach. It was as if she had vanished not just from the city, but from the world. The days turned into weeks, and Ethan's unease grew. He discovered he missed not the humiliated figure, but the woman who had silently defied him, who had revealed her knowledge of his cruelty, yet maintained a dignity no one could strip away. He missed her courage, her quiet presence yet capable of destabilizing an entire room with just a few words. And paradoxically, this absence began to corrode the millionaire's heart. For the first time, he felt a sense of emptiness unfilled by contracts, figures, or luxuries. Sarah had taken with her something he hadn't even known he was missing. The memory that true life isn't measured in numbers, but in the invisible strength of those who resist, even when the whole world pushes them to the ground. Ethan's downfall began almost imperceptibly, like discreet cracks in a marble wall. First came gossip in the gossip column, insinuations that his coldness in business dealings wasn't going unnoticed. Then came the headlines. A video recorded by a coffee shop customer on the day of Sarah's humiliation went viral. The footage showed the manager screaming, the young woman trying to justify herself, and, in the background, Ethan watching everything with an enigmatic look before intervening. What should have made him a hero became fuel for public condemnation. "Millionaire buys dignity in coffee shop," read a venomous headline. Blogs accused him of staging an act of generosity to clean up his image. Social media was divided. Some defended him, saying he had saved Sarah. Others accused him of opportunism, claiming he had exploited the humiliation to appear benevolent. Every like, every share, was a stone thrown at him. Invitations to exclusive events began to dwindle. Business partners, fearing negative associations, discreetly withdrew. Ethan, accustomed to walking in rooms where he was revered, began to feel sidelong glances as if he were a defendant before society. The respectful silence that had accompanied him turned into judgmental whispers. Within him, Sarah's image only grew. Each public accusation seemed to reinforce the idea that it wasn't he who was the true target of the story, but she, and that somehow by disappearing, she had left him exposed, naked, before a world that never forgives weakness. For the first time, the untouchable man felt the bitter taste of what she had lived her entire life, being judged defenseless, condemned by eyes that don't know his truth. And it was in this abyss of criticism and loneliness that Ethan's cold shell began to crack. He, the man who had always prided himself on needing no one, was now hostage to the memory of a woman who had defied him and to a society that, ironically, reproduced against him the same cruelty that had once crushed her. Ethan Caldwell, the man who had grown accustomed to dominating boardrooms, crushing competitors with a handshake, and dictating the pace of others' lives with his fortune, began to see his own image shatter in the mirror. The weight of public judgment wasn't just external, it seeped into him, eroding certainties and disarming arrogance. For the first time, he felt firsthand the loneliness that accompanies the rejected. The silence surrounding his name was no longer respect, but distrust. On sleepless nights, he walked alone through the hallways of his penthouse, surrounded by artwork and imported furniture that now seemed useless. The luxury that once symbolized power had become cold walls that echoed his loneliness. Every corner reminded him of Sarah's gaze, steadfast, courageous, unwavering in the face of humiliation. It was as if her absence had ripped away the veil that had shrouded his entire life, revealing the emptiness that money could never fill. He began visiting the same forgotten neighborhoods where Sarah had grown up, trying to understand where that strength came from. He watched children running through dimly lit streets, exhausted mothers carrying heavy bags, invisible workers whom no one applauded, And there, amid the dust and weariness of the city, he began to understand that dignity is not born of power, but of silent resistance. Every face he saw in these places showed him more of Sarah, and every memory of the coffee shop made him feel ashamed that only now did he realize the value she had always carried. The millionaire began to change in small ways. He sent anonymous meals to shelters. He discreetly helped families in debt. He cancelled frivolous events and began walking the streets without his bodyguards. But nothing filled the void left by her disappearance. Sarah wasn't just an uncomfortable memory. She was the mirror in which he finally saw himself without masks. And in that reflection, he discovered a man he hadn't known, someone capable of missing not the world's applause, but the silent presence of a woman who dared to confront him without even raising her voice. The reunion happened when Ethan no longer expected it. It was a grey afternoon in New York, the kind of day when the city seems drowned in its own haste. He was walking aimlessly, far from his glass and steel offices, when he heard a child's laughter echo from a small square hidden between old buildings. The sound made him stop. Among rusty swings and trees struggling to survive in the concrete, there she was, Sarah, her hair loose and a tired expression, but with a gentle glint in her eyes as she pushed her son on the swing. Time seemed to freeze. Ethan stood still, unable to move forward, his heart racing in a way he hadn't felt since his youth. When she noticed his presence, her gaze hardened. There was no surprise, but rather a mixture of caution and strength. He approached slowly, almost afraid that any wrong word would drive her away again. "Sarah," was all he could say. His voice, previously filled with authority, now sounded almost pleading. She remained silent for a few seconds, then placed her hand on her son's shoulder and replied firmly, "I thought you'd never find me again." Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Children ran around, mothers chatted on benches, but for them, the whole world had disappeared. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling like this was the most important moment of his life. "I reached out to you, every day, not because of what happened in the cafeteria, not because of people's judgment, but because I realized I need to understand what you carry. I need to understand you." Sarah looked away from her son, who smiled innocently, oblivious to the intensity of that moment. Her eyes welled up, but it wasn't weakness. It was a sea of memories, pain, and accumulated dignity. "And what would you do with that truth, Ethan? If you knew everything, if you knew where I came from, what I lost, what I had to endure?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at her, his eyes heavy with regret and a desire for redemption. There, before her, was no longer the untouchable millionaire, just a man stripped of his certainties, silently begging for a second chance. Not at love, but at humanity. Sarah was silent for a few seconds, as if weighing each word on an invisible scale. Her son was still playing on the swing, laughing loudly, but the world around them seemed suspended. Ethan waited, his eyes fixed on her, unsure if he could bear the answer. Finally, she took a deep breath, and her voice came out calm, but sharp as a blade. "I didn't disappear because I was afraid of you. I disappeared because I needed to understand if I could still be myself after all this. I spent my whole life being judged, discarded, humiliated. I didn't want to become just another chapter in your story of power." The words echoed like a sentence. Ethan tried to respond, but she held up her hand, interrupting him. "You've discovered who I am. You know my mother's sacrifice, the blood that brought me here. But knowing isn't enough. The question is, what would you do if I didn't accept entry into your world? Would you continue to be this cold man who buys redemption, or would you learn to live with the absence of someone who doesn't sell out?" The silence fell heavily. Ethan felt his heart tighten, unable to muster a defense. For once, it wasn't he who made the rules, it was her. Sarah turned to her son, holding his small hands. Her eyes welled up, but there was firmness in every gesture. "I don't hate you, Ethan, nor resentment, but I can't hand over my future to someone who still struggles with their own past. My son needs peace, and so do I." Ethan lowered his head, overcome not by the rejection itself, but by the clarity with which she disarmed him. There were no screams, no revenge, only the silent justice of a woman who survived the world without, ever losing her dignity. He wanted to ask for a second chance, but he understood that the decision had already been made. Sarah took a few steps away, holding her son's hand, who was looking curiously at the man standing in the background. Before disappearing into the trees of the square, she turned only once. Her look held neither contempt nor resentment, just a serene farewell, a silent goodbye that hurt more than any humiliation. That night, the city was blanketed in a fine rain, and the lights reflected off the asphalt like scattered shards of glass. Ethan walked alone through the same square where he'd last seen Sarah. The swing still creaked in the wind, empty, but imbued with the memory of her and their son. He stopped in front of the swing, touched the cold chain with his fingertips, and felt as if time had frozen there. His breath came out heavily, carrying not only longing, but the belated realization of all he'd lost. On the horizon, between the buildings that rose like indifferent giants, he saw the reflection of his own solitude. The man who had once dominated rooms and contracts was now reduced to absolute silence, watching an empty swing sway slowly. The rain fell on his face, streaming down like tears he no longer bothered to hide. In the distance, a child ran through the rain, laughing loudly, heedless of the cold or the puddles. The scene struck him like a painful memory. Sarah, holding her son's hand, disappearing into the trees. Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the night envelop him. There was no audience, no contract, no public to applaud or judge, just him, the empty swing, and the memory of a woman who showed him, without ever explaining, that dignity cannot be bought, and that some encounters exist only to transform us even if they end in silence. And so in the heart of New York, under the drizzling rain, the millionaire finally understood that the greatest punishment wasn't public humiliation or social judgment. It was the emptiness of having lost what money could never bring back. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.